Hello, my name is Genai Witter. I am a political science senior. I'm a human rights activist and an undergraduate research assistant with the Andrew Mellon Commons for Justice grant. And today I am here with Dr. Monica Barra, assistant professor of race and environment in the Department of Anthropology and the School of Earth, Ocean, and Environment. As a cultural anthropologist, her work examines the intersection of environmental change, race, geography, and political life, engineering, and the natural sciences in the U.S. The Commons for Justice grant focuses on analyzing race, risk, and resilience in 6 communities in the greater Miami area. What we work on is we work with historically marginalized communities of color. Similar to your research, we analyze the pre- and post-disaster vulnerabilities in Black and Brown coastal communities. The core of our research focuses on the intersection of race and climate change and how factors such as disinvestment, gentrification, and rising heat indexes and flooding and etc. work to further the systematic oppression these communities have been facing for decades. So thank you for taking the time to speak with us today about the dynamics of pre- and post-disaster vulnerabilities and risk in the marginalized communities, specifically here in Miami-Dade County. So, to start us off, I would love to know what made you decide to focus on environmental change and its correlation to race and geography in the U.S. Sub.
Thank you for that very kind intro. I'm really excited to talk with you guys more about this. I've said this to a lot of people. It wasn't environmental issues that really drew me into this at first, but really I've long had an interest in trying to understand the dynamics of how racialized inequalities come into being and are kind of lived and contested in the United States specifically, and how that relates to geography, place, space, how, people's relationship to home and family and the places they're from are kind of part of this larger project of both sustaining and contesting racialized inequalities. So that's first and foremost, I think, my entry point. But, when I was in graduate school, as, those of us who go through that whole process, thinking about how I wanted to apply that question. I started getting really interested in the politics of science, so kind of critical science studies, and really trying to understand science as a political and cultural formation, right? Not something that just stands outside of society, but is actually part of what constructs the conditions of everyday life.
Definitely.
And bringing that kind of into conversation with how are scientific knowledge and production related to racialized inequalities in the production of them. And then, I was looking for a place. I was like, well, where can I kind of look at this in a kind of interesting way? Because I was also interested in shifting environment. Right? And I started reading about Louisiana and understanding both the history of the South and in Louisiana in general, its racial histories, and then seeing all this attention coming to Louisiana in a kind of post-Katrina moment, not just about hurricanes and storm surge and kind of immediate hazard protection, but kind of restoring the coast and what it means to kind of deal with this ongoing crisis of wetland loss. That's kind of like the slow burn of climate change in Louisiana.
I like that a little bit.
Yeah, it was, it's very kind of fascinating. It's both, alarming and interesting. So, to me, once I started reading about the large-scale investments that Louisiana was making in science to help kind of secure the future in Louisiana, I was like, okay, maybe this is a place to go and ask these questions.
Yes.
Especially because of the history, like for me, already having an understanding of the fact that building Louisiana, engineering the coast and the lower river has all been tied to histories of people of color, be it the dispossession of indigenous people to make space for settler colonists to kind of literally reclaim those coastal wetlands and make them profitable, to the labor of enslaved Africans. And they literally, built a plantation economy So to me, I was like, this seems like a good place to kind of try and tell the story of engineering the coast and racial histories, not separately but together, right? And especially thinking forward to climate change, I was like, okay, how do we bring this context to thinking about the present? So that's kind of it was a journey to get there, but ultimately, like, I wanted to, squarely put that question of racialized inequalities at the foreground, and then use these other lenses to understand it, right? Especially in this context of climate change, and how basically as a society we're putting a lot of weight into science. It's neither evil nor good, right? But it's playing a key role, and that was a big question for me. No, this is incredibly powerful what you're producing, but they don't always see themselves in that way. So that's part of how this kind of both colorblind but also kind of politically neutral kind of mentalities is all built into our work.
Yes.
And it's and it's how a lot of us think about science, right? I'm a social scientist. I'm going to tell you out the gate that there's no such thing as a science that lives outside of society. Our values as a society are reflected in the scientific work that we do, right? Somebody's writing those research questions.
Exactly.
Somebody's setting those parameters. Those are decisions of individuals, and they're not outside of where we are, who we are.
Thank you. In your research, you use the phrase the geosocial histories of coastal restoration to state racial inequalities and geographies are forged in and through scientific knowledge, extractive industries, practices, racial histories, and transformations of coastal environments. Could you tell us a bit more about how they're forged and how this practice implicitly or explicitly erased Black and Brown historical presence from local Native spaces?
Right. Yeah, that's a concept I was using basically to kind of write a history of engineering coastal Louisiana in a way that didn't hold engineering histories separate from racial histories in Louisiana. I think for me, where I ended up landing, right, and I'm still, I think it's important to note that, like, how I'm thinking about these things are always evolving, especially as I meet new communities and new scholars and have conversations like this. But in general, what I wanted to do in my work is show that, engineering the river and engineering the coast was entirely made possible by the displacement of Indigenous peoples and the labor of Africans who were brought in to build the first levees in South Louisiana, right? I mean, basically you have no kind of science of engineering the coast without that labor, knowledge, lands and waters of Black and Indigenous community, right? And over time, we see how, at least in the Louisiana case, the maintenance of that levee system, the creation of various kinds of floodways across the state, right, to kind of abate river flooding, which used to be the biggest threat actually down there before kind of hurricanes and coastal storm surge really became an issue in Louisiana. How in many ways it has been Indigenous and land, Indigenous waters, Black land, Black waters, and communities that have been the sites for experimental on how to control water and build infrastructural protection for all of South Louisiana. So for me, it's like there's no science without thinking about the conditions that made it possible. And the conditions that make it possible are forms of racialized inequalities, right? That give you the knowledge and labor to do it.
Exactly.
Right? So for me, this is important because it gives that deep historical context to the present, right? Again, like, we don't just get what happened after Hurricane Katrina out of nowhere. So chronic underinvestment in the protection of certain communities, right? The strategic placement of certain kinds of, again, floodways was a big issue that came up in my work. And that to me is part of thinking about how the evolution of engineering coast is really tied to racial histories, and that we can't get away from that. Yeah. But it was, that was a leap for a lot of the scientists I work with. They were like, I'm not trying to reproduce like racialized inequalities in the world. And I get that, but that's also a particular view of how, racial and economic inequalities are forged, right? I mean, I think a lot of people who think it is about intent and like racialized and it's right. And there's no way on earth you're going to find in any document, even going back to like, the first, some of the first kind of charges of like the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers in the late 19th century to say like, we're going to build this on like poor Black communities, right? Or we are going to recruit Black labor to build our levees. Like nobody's going to write that down, right? But when you live in a society that's kind of implicitly like structurally built on those ingredients, then that's what you produce, right? So to me, a lot of this was like, it's not about tracing intent, right? But about seeing, science itself as something that is structurally constituted by the racialized and economic inequalities that already exist in the world.
Definitely.
So that conceptually, that's kind of where I've been working with that for my work, again, to give a deeper context to what's happening here, right? So I'm not like, oh, it's not just in this moment that climate justice and racial inequality come together.
Exactly.
Like it's long been together, especially in a place like Louisiana, but it's all just there.
In my head, the way that I kind of see it is like it's layers, like a foundation, a house, So like the main ground foundation is kind of the free labor of African American slaves brought here to build these levees or work on these plantations. And then we get the Jim Crow era where these Black and brown communities are exploited and are being paid nothing basically to continue working on these levees. And that's kind of the ground floor, the formation, and it just kind of builds on top and builds on top, but it's still there. Like if you don't address it, then it won't change. It's kind of this, I wouldn't say explicit, but it's kind of this connotation that's in the back of the entire practice, or like subconsciously in the back of the entire practice, that because this entire system has been built on the subjugation or exploitation of Black and brown communities and Indigenous communities, we can kind of continue doing that, whether it's a conscious and decision, or I don't think it's intentional now maybe, but I can't speak to that, but it's still at the very core of the entire system. So if you don't address that, you're kind of just reproducing that, like you said.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to put it, like in thinking like, if it's foundational,
Exactly.
right, then only dealing with the surface level stuff is not going to deal with it, right? Reminds me of what you were just saying, like, about like homestead in here and like property values in Florida too, right? In South Florida, like devalued property, right?
Exactly.
It becomes the rationale for how to make decisions, but if that's the only factor you're looking at, you're probably going to end up doing it. And, remaking that foundation is hard.
It is.
It's hard for everybody. Like, and it's not just, only white folks, like reproducing this, like we're all implicated in this system, so how do we like rebuild that foundation? That's the big picture.
Which also, how do we shift the narrative to make it important to kind of restructure the foundation? Because I feel like a lot of people are kind of complicit in their indifference, like, oh, it's going to be hard to fix this, but they don't realize that it's been hard for communities. Like, it's been hard for them to be at the receiving end of this, for them to be facing the brunt of all of this, and it's now time that we all work together to kind of address this issue.
Yeah, that's very true.
Thank you. So next question. When reflecting on the vulnerability of marginalized communities, you've noted that communities of color in the U.S. coastal South living in rapidly changing environments who are more readily known for becoming climate refugees in popular culture than as historically marginalized groups fighting against state-sanctioned forms of racism. In this quote, are you separating the current struggle of climate refugees from the struggles of historically marginalized groups fighting against state-sanctioned racism, or are you connecting the two as synonymous? Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I'm not separating them at all. I'm trying to connect them. And in fact, it's more of a kind of critique of the ways that terms like climate refugees, again, they kind of erase the other kind of history of communities kind of fighting for their rights, fighting to try and change the structure around them that are sort of like producing the conditions that make them quote unquote climate refugees in the first place. Right. I mean, I think there's an argument too here about like what like climate refugee as a very catchy headline and term, that people who are holding that label don't always are maybe not so kind of happy about being labeled as, does that make sense? And this is kind of where it comes in precisely because it has this kind of silencing effect that almost is like, well, now like indigenous communities, for example, like Ile de Jean Charles in Louisiana, this was really, I think it was like the New York Times headline now was saying, America's first climate refugees, like that. And I think a lot of members of that community were frustrated because it really kind of narrowed their experience to being a vulnerable community, to being a victim, and kind of erased all of the hard work. Like they've been trying to get a form of, we will call it relocation, but the language of the tribe has long been, community unification.
Yes.
They've been trying to get to do that for like a decade before they got that big federal grant to do what they're doing now, which, is also something that's a fraught process as well. But I think that term sometimes it doesn't really get at the deeper histories of how they kind of get into this position in the first place, right? And it becomes, again, more of like, look, the United States is investing in like climate change adaptation strategies, and like, isn't this so fabulous? And I think for many, tribal members, and I wouldn't want to necessarily speak on behalf of them, like it's easy to find, I think, how they have represented themselves and their relationship both to this term as well as to some of those buyout processes. But I think it's been problematic for them, right? The kind of depictions of their communities as just victims.
Exactly.
And not, sovereign peoples who've lived there for generations, who have fought for generations to stay there and to have their priorities and cultural values at the forefront of be it climate change planning or just general land use.
Exactly.
In South Louisiana. So I think that's part of why it's like one of those terms that kind of covers up those histories, and those contexts matter. And that's another thing that myself and a lot of other scholars working with frontline communities in Louisiana, like ad nauseum, are right? Like you can't move forward without thinking about the conditions that produce the practice.
Exactly.
And that is not the orientation of, we have no time left to lose, we need to make a plan, and there is an urgency there for sure. There's an urgency, but there's a real danger in just kind of a reactive stance that doesn't take seriously how we got to the present moment.
Exactly. I think it also, to me, kind of seems like a scapegoat, if anything. Like, so we have these decades of, not even decades, like these years of pretending or ignoring the histories, right, as these marginalized communities, like the racial histories that they faced. And it's kind of like, oh, okay, well, this is a new issue, but it's a whole new issue separate from that history. And it's like, it's literally just another arm of this kind of institutional racism and institutional bias towards these communities. And we're seeing it play out in a different way, but it's the same exact thing that they've been fighting against.
Yeah, no, that's true. And honestly, I do think, the refugee term, like to conflate their experience with the experiences of people who are political refugees and asylum seekers is also very problematic, because, if we are using refugee in its kind of historical sense of the term, it's not about floodwaters, right? It's usually people fleeing countries because of oppressive political regime, right? So I am personally uncomfortable with that term because I do not think it's the right one, right? Because it's like, well, like, is this the same as like the U.S. government chasing indigenous people out of the land here? Like, is it a modern day Trail of Tears, right? And I those are the questions that come up for me when this term is kind of invoked. So, it's a tricky thing to navigate for sure.
So next question. In the article, a model controversy using environmental competency groups to inform coastal restoration planning in Louisiana, you outlined that there should be a, quote, shift of culture of coastal restoration planning away from implicit hierarchies between local and scientific knowledge, that these engagements aren't simply a matter of collecting and testing local or traditional knowledge, but developing a collective and shared understanding of an environmental problem and a knowledge based on confronting it. So you say such an approach can be particularly insightful for climate change planning at a regional level, where opportunities for deep and regular engagement among participants is feasible. So how do we engender supporting this shift away from this hierarchical approach to instead promoting inclusive cooperation that allows for supporting community building and community capacity with a collaboratory approach?
Yeah.
That was a lot.
No, it's and part that article was written at the end of doing a year-long collaboration project that was a participatory modeling project that I did with collaborators and colleagues at the Water Institute of the Gulf, and with a group of fishermen, landowners, community representatives from St. Bernard Parish, which is also kind of just outside of New Orleans, kind of in the coastal area there. So I think there's two things. One, I think doing kind of research projects like that one, I think there's an inherent kind of openness to how you design those things. So for me and my collaborators, we wanted to figure out a way to bring, as I think I said earlier, like how do we bring a modeler, an engineer into a space with a fisherman, right? And to kind of have them talk across their various, their respective deep knowledges of the same places, right? But coming from very different, backgrounds, right? One from working the water and one from kind of studying in a very intricate manner how water moves, right? And building simulations of how water and land move. So to me, like one of those steps was just getting folks in this room, right? And kind of breaking down this kind of space between the two, because scientists and community members don't often have a lot of opportunities to be in dialogue with each other in the first place. So part of the design of that particular research project was having regular group meetings, and making sure that every meeting gave some space for folks to just get to know each other, and kind of debunk the myth of the kind of irate fisherman, the cool, detached modeler who doesn't care about what's happening on the coast. So even just having that space, I think, mattered so much, right? And then the next step was trying to figure out how to speak across their different languages, right? Because what we wanted to do was be able to have these groups come together and talk about how to set up model parameters, like what data sets should or shouldn't be used, and then to work together to think through what different kinds of projects have. This was highly ambitious. This is a really hard thing to do, right? I think I say that in that article. It's not just great, everybody came together and it was so easy. And it was very hard, explaining kind of what the modelers needed to do their work and translating kind of the conversations we would have as a group. So it was really it was interesting to see how that came together. To me, I was less interested in the outputs, right? So some of my colleagues were like, okay, we need to have a report. We need to have recommendations from this research project. Yes, so that's part of it. And we came up with that. But to me, the real interesting part of it was how do we chip away at shifting, this idea of shifting the culture of science, which is really interesting to me, and that takes time. And that takes building relationships, caring about each other, right? So I think that's a key part of yes, knowledge exchange, yes, collaboration, but also just building those relations, because I think that's also how you come to do your work differently. My time with coastal communities in Louisiana has taught me so much that I couldn't just get out of the book or out of the lectures, that my professors were giving me, as great as that information can be. There's no substitute for kind of knowing people and knowing their experience, just like you and I are doing right now, sitting down and listening and talking to them. So I think having more opportunities for that would be great. The bigger question for me comes in with how can we take those kinds of models and collaborative science and scale them up to actually informing policy. And this is something a lot of folks, ask me about. A lot of my colleagues are working on too. And that requires, I think, a bigger shift in terms of policy and ultimately the power to make decisions for what projects are going to be funded and how and why. And that's something like, we did this project. It was great. Everybody was happy with it. And one of the biggest recommendations I think that came out of it was how to give the kind of movable power to coastal communities to actually shape policy decisions. Because even scientists feel like they're like, look, we're not making the decisions. And they're not. They're providing the fodder, if you will, the data that is the evidence that policymakers are using. Like, they're like, we didn't just decide this, right? The state is like, we're not just making these decisions. Like, they use science. Like, don't attack us. I feel like this came up in one community meeting I went to with a state official from the Restoration Authority, and community members were like yelling and hollering at him. I mean, he was getting flustered. It was just one of those meetings. Everybody was having a day that afternoon. And he was like, don't attack me. He's like, attack the science. This is what the science says. And of course, scientists are definitely not going to be up there saying these things. So it's a weird, how do we get any kind of collaborative and experimental approach to trying to do science differently up into the capacity to actually change policy? Like, that is the much harder question for me. In some ways, I think it's easier to shift the culture of science. I hope, because I feel like there's a little bit more autonomy there. And if it's a research project, I think scientists are all willing to get on board. But then how you scale that up, if you will, that's the big challenge, But my hope is that the more scientists that we pull into the kind of critical social science, critical cultural studies side of things, my hope is that will also change the nature of the work. Because I think a lot of us have that experience too. And I've met scientists who are like, once I started working with Indigenous communities, my whole perspective on what I do shifted. Mm-hmm. So it matters. And I think that's one of the ways to do it. But it is so hard. Mm-hmm. But I do not think it's impossible. Mm-hmm. I mean, science is not that hopeful. Yeah, like Western science, at least a lot of these things. So I think there's a possibility for it. I do think if scientists made more demands to do that, it would help.
Definitely. That's something that we kind of said here at the grant is community capacity and kind of having the communities be able to have a seat at the table and make decisions on behalf of what's going to affect them and their generations. And back to that thing about bringing the fishermen and the scientists together. So there's like this term that I've created. It's called the duality of expertise. And I think that a lot of the times in these academic spaces, we kind of just disregard the entire experience of people. Like, lived experience is knowledge. It might not be academic knowledge, but especially when I was interviewing and researching the communities of Homestead and kind of like how they bounced back after Andrew, a lot of them, they know exactly what's going on. They might not know the terms for it, but they work there, we live there, they see their ecosystems changing, they see their environment changing, they see the impact that these extreme weather events are having, and they can also advocate for themselves. They have that knowledge. It might not be branded in a degree, it might not be the same as a scientist, but I still think that it is just as important as science, like they need to come together. There needs to be some sort of facilitation of a collaboration between the two, because you can't have one without the other. Science can't be this neutral thing, like you said, because it is affecting people, and the people that it's affecting, they should be able to advocate for themselves in these spaces. So that brings me to my other question. How can memory, experiences, and perspectives, art, and artifacts play a role in providing insight into understanding environmental change and responses that we should consider in pre- and post-disaster environments such as Miami-Dade County or Louisiana?
Yeah, so I mean, some of the work that I've done and have written up, I guess, in my work in Louisiana has focused on the role of memory and collective memory for frontline communities in particular, and really thinking about it as how do I put this exactly? It's part of what holds kind of communities together, right? And for where I work in particular, being that multi-generational communities matters, right? And how the community itself understands their, their history, their fights for political autonomy, the values that they have. A lot of that is stretched across, generations where, there is very much a deference to elders and the history as part of what informs the present. So in that sense, I don't know if we could necessarily call like community collective memory like a strategy per se for adaptation, but I think understanding the core values of communities and trying to figure out ways to incorporate that into how we're approaching bigger questions about how to adapt to climate change. Because look, everybody knows something, like we need to do something, right? It's not as if communities in Louisiana are like anti-restoration or anti-climate change adaptation, right? They've been doing it. They've been living it. I think you said this already, right? So part of this is like, what are the strategies, but also like the values, right? That have worked for communities, and how can we share this, again, sharing in terms of what communities feel comfortable sharing, but use it as a way to kind of radically rethink what adaptation might even mean. So to me, this is where things like facilitating conversations between youth and elders kind of comes in. I think certainly sharing creative work, like Louisiana has been, it's odd to think like this condition of being so kind of disaster prone has really like catapulted it into a spotlight where you have artists, filmmakers constantly come. I can't tell you how many film crews I ran into, like in Plaquemines Parish where I work, which is a very rural, very remote place, right? And I'd be like, going to a meeting or something, and people have like a camera set up, and they're filming and making these things about people. I think getting the word out helps, so I think different mediums where a wider public can connect both with the histories as well as the kind of needs of communities matters, to invest and think more critically like about cultural loss that's attached to wetland ponds.
Exactly.
How do we go about cultural preservation in ways that allow communities to kind of self-determine how to do that, right? Because cultures are not fixed, right? And this is me sounding like an anthropologist here, right? But cultures shift and change over time. And I think part of that is, in terms of climate change, how do we empower communities to have some autonomy over how those shifts are going to happen for them? And I think using visual arts, humanities, film, photography, whatever it might be, I think are just another mode of expressing these things that don't fit very neatly into policy as such, because there's some things that can't fit into algorithms and model regressions, right? And Excel spreadsheet. And I think that's part of a wider dialogue on, if climate change is really transforming our world, like what kind of world do we call it? Right? Like it is, I think in many ways, an opportunity. Right? If we think about it less as a kind of threat and as an opportunity, and there are many scholars, I think, thinking along these lines. But if it's an opportunity, we do things differently. Like, then how do we take this seriously?
Yeah.
So I think, looking to things like, I did a lot of work in kind of oral histories with communities, again, as part of building that context. But I also worked with, organizations, humanities organizations in Louisiana to develop like cultural programming and content to just start having these conversations together. Like, because it's not as if communities too, like, yes, they live it, but it's not like they're sitting around every day.
Yes.
They're like talking about like the football game, like the tag football that's going to be happening, tomorrow. And, they're talking about like homecoming, and they're talking about Mardi Gras, right? I mean, like, life is still going on in these places, right? And those are deep parts of the culture that people want to hold on to and want to see continue on into the future, right? So how do we kind of put that out front and use it, if you will, as a kind of inspiration for like how to do how to adapt, right?
Yeah.
And how to move forward, right? Because culture is always changing, communities are always changing, and now the environment around us is changing rapidly too. So, I think those things are just absolutely key for bringing nuance and creativity and more expansive thinking to what a climate changed future can be, and like what we need to prioritize and value that, again, exist outside of the biophysical and economic metric of what's going to happen.
I think that also kind of goes back to that duality of expertise, because for Black and Indigenous and historically marginalized communities, a big part of culture and a big part of their history is talking about their experiences or forming their experiences through means of art or music or that kind of thing. So I think that where scientists will have deliverables such as Excel sheets and kind of journals and that kind of thing, the deliverables to these communities based on their experiences and their kind of connection to the environment and dealing with that loss of environment and that loss of culture is their art, and the kind of conversations that they're having about that. I mean, it's just as valuable.
Yeah.
It's just as insightful, I think, to me at least. As the deliverables that we're getting from these academic spaces.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely like, and we can learn a lot from it. And I think that's also like breaking down the boundaries of like what is knowledge and what knowledge counts, because again, that's part of that shift too. Like, how do we do this differently? It's not that we definitely need all the science. It's like, we need a lot for it, of course, and I think that's a key part of it. But also, like, for me, I think about this a lot through my own experience, as a quote unquote expert, right? In that, my expertise is constantly challenged and reformulating itself as I meet people, learn new stories, and just ultimately different ways of seeing the environment, right? And this is a hard shift, especially for us coming through institutions. Like, the environment, when it's not just imagined as a resource to be managed or a threat to be managed, or an entity that you can study but you're disconnected from, I think you begin to start interacting with it in a different way, right? If the environment has been, I see this in some of my work when I talk about the political activism of oystermen and Plaquemines historically, like how oysters have been key to kind of building the kind of political work necessary to challenge like forms of state-sanctioned racism and Plaquemines, from like, Black voting rights and political representation to access to basic things like running water. The coastal environment has been a way for a lot of communities to sustain themselves when, the societies they lived in just abandoned them, right? And that's a different way of seeing the environment, right? Like, environment is not just a threat, but like an ally, right? Or when we think about Indigenous communities, how the physical world can potentially be like kin, right? Like family, right? So if a forest or if a particular wetland or a mound is actually, it's not just an object of management, but a member of your family, do you start then asking different kinds of questions about it? And then how do you go about protecting it? And those are, I hate to use like too much jargon, but like, this word like epistemological, like how we understand like the nature of knowledge, like how we make meaning in the world, right? Is more than one way. And that's what they should too. But I think the arts and humanities are really a nice way to kind of get us out of the scripts that we've been like inherited, especially coming through institutions like of higher education, to be like, well, what is the environment in the first place, right? And I think, people could write this off as like kind of the navel gazing kind of question, but ultimately, like, if you see the environment as a resource, right, you're gonna approach it, study it, manage it in a certain way. But if you see the environment as like key to securing like economic autonomy, or see it as an extension of your family, then you're going to approach managing in a completely different way.
Exactly.
So I think those are important, and figuring out creative ways to get us all thinking more expansively is the goal. Yeah.
Thank you. And so last question, we're going to end on a higher note. What are your hopes for the future?
Oh, man. I mean, I think one of the biggest ones really is that, we can redistribute the power to make decisions over our climate change futures. Like, that is a big hope for me. I think it's a really hard thing to do. But, I think giving some kind of autonomy to frontline communities is going to be key, right? And even just like basic reformulations of how we approach the problem, like as opposed to, again, as experts, going in and telling communities what they need, we step back and we're like, well, what do you need?
Exactly.
Right? I'm really interested in how science can potentially align itself with the questions that are most pressing to frontline communities, which, yes, it's storm surge inundation and things like that, but it's also things like we need jobs. We need secure housing.
Exactly.
Right? We need someone to help us navigate FEMA. Or can FEMA kind of make it a little less hard to have access to these resources? I mean, things like that where, to me, if the agenda of climate change planning and research can align itself with the work that's being done by a lot of communities around at least the United States and the world, trying to think about, how do we undo racial inequalities and structural inequalities? Like, how do we do anti-racist science? Right? How can we link these groups together, right? So actually do science kind of in the service of social justice, right? And that's going to mean shifting some priorities, I think, for science, right? So I do think, like, if you ask a group of, an ecologist, a modeler, and a geologist in South Louisiana, like, all right, like, can you design a research project with an Indigenous community that prioritizes, ensuring that we can restore some of the scenic wetlands around them, but also not compromise the capacity of these communities to feed themselves, right? If they're semi-subsistence fishermen, can they still live there, right? If they can't live there, is there a way to design this project in a way where they can still have access to this space, right? Is this also a conversation where we need to bring in people who do housing policy?
Yeah.
Right. So kind of getting more creative in that way, right? Because if you design restoration around, securing the capacity of coastal communities to be economically independent, right? Or build sovereignty into a research project, right? Or build like self-determination, like can restoration support self-determination? Can it be about more than just land building? I think is really my hope and desire and like push to my colleagues and collaborators and in doing this work. And that's what I try to talk to folks about. So that's where I would go. First of all.
Well, I am optimistic because I think that it starts right here.
Yeah.
With this, with people watching, with the work that we're doing, and I'm also optimistic for the future. So thank you so much for coming here.
I mean, it's exciting to see you and like who's like here in South Florida doing this work and so important. So thank you for your time. I appreciate the invitation to be here.
Thank you.